a system living on borrowed time. By the early 1970s, the Soviet Union looked formidable from the outside. It had nuclear weapons. It had a space program. It had won the Second World War at catastrophic cost and turned itself into a superpower within a generation. But inside the machine, something had already stopped working. The centrally planned economy had no mechanism for innovation, no way to respond to changing needs, and no honest way to measure failure. Growth figures were fabricated up the chain of command because the system punished bad news. Consumer goods were chronically scarce. Agricultural output was so poor that the Soviet Union, a country with some of the most fertile land on Earth, was importing grain from the West by the 1970s. The gap between what the system claimed and what ordinary people experienced in their daily lives had become impossible to ignore. And then there was oil. Soviet oil exports had been quietly propping up the entire system. As long as prices were high, the problems could be papered over. When global oil prices collapsed in 1986, the paper ran out. A former CIA chief of staff later described it as the equivalent of stepping on their oxygen tube. The system wasn't reforming. It was decaying. And the man who finally came to power, knowing that and determined to do something about it, would inadvertently bring the whole structure down. The weight of Afghanistan. Before Gorbachev arrived, there was Afghanistan. In December 1979, Soviet forces invaded, expecting a quick stabilization of a friendly communist government. What followed was nearly 10 years of grinding, unwinnable war. The Mujahideen, armed in part by the United States and Pakistan, controlled the countryside. The Soviet army controlled the roads and the cities, and slowly, nothing else. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. Tens of thousands more came home wounded or broken in ways that didn't show up in official statistics. The war was conducted in near total secrecy at home. Zinc coffins arrived in towns and cities with no explanation. Parents who asked questions were told to stay quiet, but people talked. The truth passed from mouth to mouth the way all Soviet truth did, quietly, sideways, in kitchens. Gorbachev, on taking power in 1985, called the war a bleeding wound. He began the withdrawal in 1988. By February 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed back into the USSR. The commander, General Boris Gromov, walked across the bridge alone, the last man out of a war his country had pretended was going well for a decade. Afghanistan had done something the economists couldn't fully quantify. It had broken the trust between the state and the people who served it. The myth of Soviet invincibility had not survived the mountains. Gorbachev and the opening of the wound. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985, inheriting a country that had watched 3 of its leaders die in 3 years. He was not a radical. He believed in socialism. He wanted to save the system, not destroy it. His 2 signature policies, glasnost and perestroika, were meant to be scalpels. Glasnost meant openness, relaxing censorship, allowing criticism of officials, letting the press report more of the truth. Perestroika meant restructuring, limited market mechanisms, decentralization, reduced bureaucracy. Together, they were supposed to make the Soviet Union more efficient and more honest. Instead, glasnost revealed to millions of people just how much they had been lied to, about history, about the economy, about everything. And once people could see the lies, they couldn't unsee them. Chernobyl, the lie that couldn't be contained. On the 26th of April 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded. It was the worst nuclear accident in history. A cloud of radioactive material drifted across the Soviet Union and into Europe. The Soviet government's first instinct was to cover it up. It kept the explosion out of the press for 2 days. It did not notify neighboring countries. It was only after a worker at a nuclear plant in Sweden, 700 miles away, detected radiation on his own shoes that Moscow was forced to acknowledge what had happened. Gorbachev himself waited more than 2 weeks before speaking to the public on television. His first response was to attack the Western press for spreading lies. The cover-up failed, not because the government chose transparency, but because the radioactive cloud crossed borders. The entire world was watching a Soviet reactor burn, while Soviet officials said nothing was wrong. For people inside the USSR, it was the clearest possible demonstration of something they had long suspected. The state would let them die rather than admit a mistake. Chernobyl cost billions to contain. It poisoned a region, and it destroyed what remained of public faith in the system's competence. Gorbachev later called it the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The nations wake up. The Soviet Union was not one country. It was 15 republics, dozens of nationalities, and hundreds of languages, most of them held together by force and ideology, not affection. When glasnost made it possible to speak publicly about the past, the republics began speaking about theirs. The Baltic states went first. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent nations until Soviet occupation in 1940. They had never stopped considering themselves occupied. In August 1989, exactly 50 years after the secret Nazi-Soviet pact that had delivered them to Stalin, 2 million people formed a human chain across all three countries, stretching 675 kilometers from Tallinn through Riga to Vilnius. They held hands and stood in silence. The world watched. Lithuania declared independence in March 1990. Moscow imposed an economic blockade. In January 1991, Soviet special forces stormed the television tower in Vilnius. 14 people were killed, but the troops withdrew under international pressure, and Lithuania did not back down. Across the Union, other republics were drawing the same conclusion. The center could no longer hold by fear alone. The system eats itself. By 1991, the Soviet economy was in free fall. Shelves in state shops were empty. The ruble was collapsing. Factories that had been operating for decades stopped paying their workers because there was nothing to pay them with. People stood in lines for hours for bread, sugar, and cigarettes. A society that had built itself on the promise of collective security and guaranteed employment was watching both disappear simultaneously. The political system was fracturing in parallel. The Communist Party, which had run the country without challenge for 70 years, was losing its authority over the republics. Yeltsin, elected president of Russia in June 1991, was openly defying Gorbachev and positioning the Russian Republic as a sovereign state separate from the Union. The center was dissolving not through revolution, but through the quiet withdrawal of authority. Gorbachev's reforms had created a political opening that the hardliners inside the party viewed with horror. In their reading, the Soviet Union was dying because its leader had allowed it to. They decided to act. 3 days in August. On the morning of the 19th of August 1991, Soviet citizens turned on their televisions and found Swan Lake. The state channels were playing classical music and ballet, the traditional signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong in the Kremlin. A group of hardline communist officials announced that Gorbachev was ill and that they had assumed control of the country. Gorbachev was, in fact, under house arrest at his vacation dacha in Crimea. Tanks rolled into Moscow. The coup had begun. But something unexpected happened. The people did not comply. Boris Yeltsin drove to the Russian parliament building, climbed onto a tank outside it, and spoke through a megaphone to the crowd that had gathered to resist. He called the coup illegal, called the plotters criminals, and called on the military not to fire on their own people. Tens of thousands flooded into the streets of Moscow. In Leningrad, 200,000 gathered in protest. Soldiers began defecting. The coup leaders, expecting the passive submission of a terrorized society, found instead that something had changed, that years of glasnost had produced a people who would no longer simply look away. 3 days after it began, the coup collapsed. Its leaders were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the coup had fatally damaged him. He had been held prisoner by the very party he led. The day he returned, Yeltsin publicly humiliated him, forcing him on live television to read a document confirming that his entire cabinet had backed the coup. Gorbachev suspended the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The party that had built the USSR had lost all authority, and the union it had built could not survive without it. The end. The republics moved immediately. In the weeks following the coup, nearly every Soviet republic declared independence. Ukraine held a referendum on the 1st of December 1991. Over 92% voted to leave. Without Ukraine, the second most powerful republic in the Union, the breadbasket of the USSR, the historic heart of the Slavic world, a meaningful union was not possible. Everyone knew it. On the 8th of December, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met at a government dacha in the ancient forest of Belovezhskaya Pushcha in Belarus and signed the Belovezh Accords. They declared that the Soviet Union no longer existed and replaced it with a loose commonwealth of independent states. They did not consult Gorbachev. They informed him afterward. On the 25th of December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk in the Kremlin and signed his resignation as president of a country that had already ceased to exist. He had tried to reform an unreformable system, and the attempt had brought the whole structure down. Whether that makes him a hero or a tragedy depends on what you believe he owed to history. That evening, the red hammer and sickle flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor was raised in its place. 15 nations stood where one had been. Each now had to figure out alone what it was. What was left? The Soviet Union did not fall because of a single cause. It fell because of all of them at once. An economy that couldn't feed itself, a war it couldn't win, a disaster it couldn't cover up, a reform it couldn't control, and a population that had finally stopped believing. It had lasted 69 years. In that time, it had industrialized a peasant country, defeated Nazi Germany, launched the first human into space, and built enough nuclear weapons to end life on Earth several times over. It had also killed tens of millions of its own people, suppressed entire nations, and maintained a system built on organized lying. What it left behind was not a clean slate. Russia fell into chaos and then autocracy. Ukraine spent 30 years fighting for the right to choose its own direction and is still fighting now. The Central Asian republics became authoritarian states built on oil and silence. The Baltic states ran toward Europe and NATO as fast as they could and made it. The questions the Soviet Union raised about how power is built, how empires end, and what people will tolerate before they stop tolerating it did not end on the 25th of December 1991. They are still being answered. If you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.